Hey guys, welcome to the first video of Unit 5 where we're going to be talking about the skeletal system. We're kind of lucky in this way because we've had our lab already, so we've looked at some of this in the lab, so you'll hear me referring back to the things we looked at in lab as we go through at least the first part of this video. Alright, so let's just start off with the purpose of the skeleton, and what the functions of the skeleton are. So, of course, we know the main purpose of the skeleton is to provide a framework, for our entire body. Another major thing that the skeleton does is to protect our inner organs. If you think about the rib cage and the skull, it protects our vital organs. It allows us to move by having a rigid framework for our muscles to work against. It enables movement. And I mentioned in the lab that we use it for storage. So we store calcium salts. There's other minerals that we store within the matrix of our bone. We talked about storage of fat and blood, for that matter. It also produces, or it houses the cells that produce a lot of our blood cells. Now, if we have a look at the bones, we need to have a good idea of the structure of the bone in order to understand the skeleton as a whole. The long bones are what we call bones that are longer than they are thick. So most of the bones that we find in the appendages, so the arms and the legs, are classified as long bones, but you can also have ribs and so on. So the long bone is the typical bone we think of. And we talked about this organization yesterday in the lab, where we have a soft marrow core that's either red or yellow marrow, the spongy bone that surrounds that tissue, and that'll extend through the middle of the shaft and out towards the end, and the ends of the bones are what we call the epiphyses, if you see that word there. And then the compact bone, which makes up the outer part of the bone, the stuff we can hold on to, and I was showing you in lab yesterday just how hard that compact bone is. And that makes up the outer part of the bone, and certainly a decent part of the shaft. And the shaft of the bone is generally called as the diaphyses. Now, there are some membranes associated with the bone, just like we talked about when we were talking about other connective tissues. We have a membrane called the periosteum, and this is going to be the membrane covering directly outside of the bone. We have another membrane inside that covers the bone marrow, so the cavity around the bone marrow, and that's called the endosteum. And then we finally have these the inner layer right inside the periosteum. We have a group of membranes that are mostly cells, these osteoblasts, and therefore growth and repair of bones, and we'll talk a bit more about those in a couple of slides. Now, the osseous tissue, which is another word for bone, the osseous tissue spaces between the cells of the bone tissue, they're permeated with those hard mineral deposits and those calcium salts. So that's what gives the bone its really rigid matrix, its really rigid structure. And there's two types of bone tissue, or osseous tissue: the compact bone, like we were talking about in lab yesterday, and of course the spongy bone, which is right inside of it. The spongy bone can also be called the cancellous bone. So spongy can also be called the cancellous bone. Alright, so just have a look at a couple of aspects of each one of those types of bone tissue. Let's talk about the spongy bone first. So that's located on the proximal and distal ends of the long bones, and also in the center of most other bones. So this is, like I said, the stuff that we can refer to as cancellous bone. So it's a network, a meshwork of small bony plates, and in between those bony plates we'll find the red bone marrow. Okay, and the spongy bone is where we'll find the production of most of our red blood cells, and then some of the white blood cells and the platelets, like we discussed yesterday. Now, the other type of bone is the compact bone, and this is the stuff that's really hard and really dense. We find it on the shaft of the long bones, on the outer parts of the bones. It will surround those central haversian canals that have the nerves and the blood vessels, and another form of protection. And it contains those units, the haversian system that we talked about yesterday, and in lab I was calling them osteons. So haversian system, or osteon, is the same thing, that organization that we talked about in lab yesterday with the haversian canal, the lamellae, and the canaliculi. Okay, so within our bones we've got those two types of bone marrow. We've got the red marrow and the yellow marrow. Now the red marrow is found in the proximal and distal ends of the long bones, so at the end of those bones, and it consists mostly of myeloid tissue. And myeloid tissue is a bigger word for bone marrow tissue. In that you're going to find blood cells in different stages of development. You can have fully developed blood cells, or recently developed or developing blood cells, and this type of tissue is where we can look for for stem cells. If you ever needed to give stem cells, if you wondered how that worked, quite often they'll take a really large needle and they'll put it into your hip bone, because there's a big section of red bone marrow that's easily accessible, and they'll take stem cells from the red bone marrow in your hip. Red bone marrow is, like I said, the site of blood cell formation, and it's the only one that's really present at birth. Okay, we don't lay down any yellow marrow until after we were born. Now, speaking of yellow marrow, the yellow marrow is usually found in the center of the long bones, like through the shaft, and it's mostly made up of adipose tissue, like we talked about yesterday, because we use it for storing fat. And it forms throughout the aging process. We store more and more fat, and it can be converted back to red bone marrow. We can switch that tissue back during times of hematopoietic stress, and that just means if there's some type of stress on our circulatory system or our ability to produce blood, then we'll switch our yellow marrow back to red blood marrow so that we've got more potential to produce blood cells. Okay, so the anatomy of the bone is just basically a review of what we went into yesterday in the lab. Don't forget, we get the osteons here with our central haversian canal, the lamellae, which are the rings that go around the outside of the haversian canal. So here is our haversian canal, and then we have the lamellae. It almost looks like a target when I'm doing this. And on those lamellae, we're going to find the osteocytes, that are living in the lacunae. And then these little tiny black lines we'll have running from the haversian canals out to the cells. Those are going to be the canaliculi. And that part will make up the compact bone. So the compact bone is the type of bone we're going to see down here in the smaller picture. You can see along the outside. That's going to make up our compact bone. And on the inside of that, we're going to have our spongy bone, the cancellous bone. And we will also find the cancellous bone, starting in here in this area. The medullary cavity that we can see up here, that's going to be full of that spongy type of bone. And in that spongy bone, you're going to have your red bone marrow. So this is going to be our red bone marrow here, and then you'll have the medullary cavity, which is where we'll find the yellow bone marrow down here. So that's the anatomy of the bone. I think we had a pretty good look at it in lab yesterday, and everybody seemed to be pretty comfortable with it. Okay, so we've talked about the organization of the tissue. Now we'll need to talk about some of the cells that are present in the tissue. Now for the first three right here, whoops, let's turn on some. These three here are all going to be different types of cells. Okay, the osteocytes we've already talked about. Right, those are mature bone cells. They live in the lacunae, and they're there for growth and repair, for maintenance, to make sure the existing bone stays healthy and carries out regular metabolism. There's two other types of cells, osteoblasts and osteoclasts. Now, very often when you see blast at the end of a cell, it means it makes something. So these types of cells are makers, or they're synthesizers. When you see clasts, it's a good type of it's a good bet that these types of cells will remove or reabsorb tissue. Okay, so in this case here, we've got our osteocytes, which are our healthy bone cells. We have our osteoblasts, which are cells that would move in if we needed to repair or make more matrix. So these are the cells that are going to produce the matrix. And then we have the osteoclasts, and these would come along if for some reason we needed to remodel that bone, so we needed to remove some of the matrix for growing, or if there's an injury or something to that effect, the osteoclasts will come in and they will take down the matrix. So they'll move it and reabsorb some of that bone. Some of the common stuff where you'd see that would be in your teeth. As you get older, sometimes in the event of periodontal disease, you can have osteoclasts that move in, and because teeth aren't as strong as they used to be, there can be some reabsorption of bone, which makes the teeth a bit loose, or they can even get to the point of falling out. So those are 3 different types of cells that are associated with bone tissue. The last one down here, the last definition on this slide, is ossification, and that's when we go from a cartilage precursor, like we talked about yesterday, the chondrocytes, to an osteocyte. The bone replaces the cartilage to form our skeleton. Now this will start to happen in the embryonic stage, so you will start to see ossification in the embryo as the embryo and the fetus is starting or going through development. Now we talked about the growth of the long bone, or the ossification, yesterday in the lab, and we'll go over a little bit here on this slide as well, but the order of the stages is laid out pretty well on this slide. So we're going to change from what is initially cartilage eventually to bone. So the cartilage in the long bones will start to transform generally in the center of the shaft. So if we think about a long bone, and I'm going to draw a bad one here, we'll start to get ossification centers usually right here in the center of the shaft, and most times on the bigger bones they'll happen out at the ends of the shaft as well. And as these bones grow, the osteocytes move in and they start to form bone in directions away from these ossification centers. So the bone starts from 3 different parts of the bone development starts from 3 different parts of the bone, and as they grow in length, they'll also grow in width, so that the bone maintains proper proportions and it grows up in the healthy form that we would expect. As we get older, of course, these bones, the ossification will meet each other, and when we get to these places where the bone centers join up, once these fuse into solid bone, that's the end of growth, and that's as tall as you're going to get, or that's as long as that bone is going to get. There's a couple of different definitions that are associated with markings on bones. Okay, we've got what we call depressions and openings. Now depressions and openings are where we find bones generally come to form joints, or it allows for places like soft tissue stuff to pass through a bone. Okay, so that's what depressions and openings usually do. Processes are outgrowths or projections that grow off or stick out of bones. Generally, processes are where we'd find attachment of connective tissue. So that's where tendons or ligaments are going to connect the bone to the musculature system. So first we'll have a look at the bone markings for depressions and openings, and we've got these 5 different types of openings and depressions. We get a fissure, foramen, a fossa, a sulcus, and a meatus. Now all these things are either a depression, or a push into area on the bone, or an opening, so a space. So a fissure is a narrow slit between 2 adjacent bones. A foramen is a large opening in the bone, and the most popular one is going to be at the base of the skull where the spinal cord exits. A fossa is a shallow depression, so a little bit of a push in on the bone. A sulcus is a furrow or a depression that can accommodate a nerve or a blood vessel. Okay, and a meatus is a tube-like opening. So the meatus would be an example would be how your auditory nerve gets to the outside part of your skull. Now the next ones are the processes, and these are there's a bunch of these: the condyle, the facet, the head, the crest, the epicondyle, line, a spinous process, a trochanter, and tuberosity. The best way to learn these, of course, is to have a look at this slide here, and this will give you not only the definition, but it'll point out what each one of these looks like on a real bone. So review this slide, please.